It happened a few years back, late one night. I was half asleep, maybe dozing for 20 minutes at best, when I heard the sound of glass shattering. The moment that window broke, my mind jolted awake like I had been hit with a bucket of cold water. My first instinct was to grab my phone and call the cops, but that hope died fast when I remembered I had left it downstairs charging in the kitchen. I crept to the top of the stairs and peered into the darkness. That is when I saw him, a shadowy figure sitting quietly at my kitchen table. The lights were off, so I could not make out his features, but the stench that filled the air hit me hard. It smelled like rot, filth, and unwashed skin. I knew right away this guy was homeless. At first, I thought about throwing him out, but then, as I reached for the light switch and the room lit up, the anger drained out of me. The man sitting at my table looked like he was barely holding on. He was painfully thin, his clothes tattered and stained, with patches of greasy, stringy hair falling unevenly from his scalp. His beard looked just as scraggly, like it had been growing unchecked for months. There was this distant, haunted look in his eyes, like someone who had seen too much and lost all hope. Tears gathered at the corners of his eyes, and for a moment, he seemed more like a broken man than a threat. I was about to tell him to leave when my throat tightened in fear. I noticed the shotgun sitting across his lap. Swallowing my panic, I asked, "What do you want?" But the man gave no sign he even heard me. He just sat there staring straight ahead, lost in some distant thought. Looking at him, I could tell he had not eaten in days, maybe weeks. Growing up, I was always told to give homeless folks food instead of money so they would not spend it on alcohol or drugs. So I decided to warm up some leftovers in the microwave. While the food spun and heated, I tried to talk to him, asking if there was someone I could call or if he needed help. He gave no response at first, barely even glancing at the plate I set in front of him when it was ready. For the longest time, he stayed silent, but when he finally spoke, the words that came out of his mouth would change everything. "My name's Cole Dyer," he said, voice low and hollow. "I have killed 20 people." The second he said that, I broke down, sobbing and pleading for my life. I know it sounds shameful, but I was terrified. Cole's face twisted with anger, and he barked at me to shut up and sit down. He said he was not finished talking. Once I did what he asked, he leaned forward and told me the story of how it all began. His first victim was a prostitute. He strangled her with his bare hands, but at that time, he did not really know what he was doing. He had not figured out how he wanted to kill, or even realized that he would crave it afterward. After the first murder, Cole sat around waiting for the cops to come knocking at his door. But days went by, and nothing happened. No police, no detectives. That is when it hit him. Nobody was coming. He was free. With that realization, Cole said he felt something change inside him, like a switch had been flipped. No longer feeling like just another cog in society's machine, his twisted fantasies began to take on a life of their own. Soon enough, he had given himself a name, the Pass It On Killer. He explained the meaning behind it in great detail, his voice carrying this strange mix of pride and righteousness. In his warped mind, he believed that if he killed enough pests, as he called them, the universe would reward him with good fortune. As a symbol of his work, he would cut off the head of each victim and leave it behind at the next murder scene, replacing the old one with the latest. Cole learned early on that killing people he knew was too risky, so he started targeting strangers. He told me that people love to talk about themselves more than they should. All it took was asking the right questions, and folks would spill their guts about anyone causing them trouble. He bragged about how good he was at getting people to open up. "I can talk the devil into setting himself on fire," he said with a grin. From casual conversations, he would figure out where these pests lived, where they worked, what cars they drove, whatever he needed to know to find them. Most of the time, Cole said he ended up sparing the people he tracked down. "I am paranoid and meticulous," he explained, "always second-guessing, running through every little detail in my head to make sure nothing goes wrong." Because the killings were scattered all over the country and none of the victims were connected, the police had no clue who they were looking for. Not once did Cole get brought in for questioning about what he smugly referred to as his hobby. At this point, Cole leaned forward and told me to grab a pen and paper. "Write this down," he said flatly. With the shotgun still resting on his lap, I figured the smart move was to do exactly what he asked. No way I was going to take a chance that the gun was not loaded or that I was quick enough to run. While I scribbled down his words, Cole told me about the time he scouted a potential victim near a row of rundown apartment buildings. It was late, and he was rummaging through trash bins behind the place, hoping to gather anything useful about his next target. That was when he noticed a small group huddled outside someone's basement apartment, whispering through a cracked window. He could not see them clearly from where he stood, but Cole described them as greasy and filthy, with long, tangled hair and scruffy beards. There was something unnatural about them, though. Their eyes, he said, they burned like anthracite. The whispering stopped all at once, and each one of them slowly turned their eyes toward Cole. That look alone made his heart lurch. He turned and hurried toward his car, but just as he reached it, he stole a glance over his shoulder, and there they were. The group was following him, staying just outside the reach of the streetlights. It freaked me out, Cole admitted. I already hated the idea of doing a job in an apartment building. Too many nosy neighbors. But after seeing them, I knew I wasn't going back there. On the 5-hour drive home, he kept checking the rearview mirror, sure that the group was tailing him. Never saw anything, he said, rubbing his face. But the next day, I noticed a car creeping through the parking lot where I live. It would circle around every few hours. I was smoking a lot of weed back then, so I figured maybe I was just being paranoid. He paused, tapping the table. Then that night, I woke up to tapping on my door. Cole rocked back and forth slightly, like a nervous child trying to calm himself as he kept talking. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I started hearing them whisper my name, right from the hallway. He walked slowly to his front door and looked out through the peephole. There were 5 of them, he whispered. Their faces were filthy and drawn, half hidden beneath long, greasy hair. Their eyes, deep-set, almond-shaped and empty, glimmered with something far worse than anger. It was like pure hatred, raw and sharp, radiating from them. And it scared even me. They spent the whole night outside, begging me to come out. Cole said it as if he still could not believe it. It was not uncommon in his building to hear drunk exes banging on doors late at night, so the noise went on and on without anyone doing much about it. Eventually, though, a neighbor, someone Cole barely knew, just another tenant who shared a thin wall with him, decided to poke her head out and tell them off. She got about halfway through telling them to shut up, Cole said, his voice lowering. Then she just froze. The group rushed her, shoving her backward into her apartment, and Cole could hear them tearing through her place. Her screams filled the air, but they only seemed to make the group laugh harder. If I didn't have number 19's head sitting in my freezer, Cole said, rubbing his temples, I swear to God, I would have called the cops. The strangers made the woman beg for Cole, her voice shaking as she called out to him through the thin wall. They told her what to say, Cole said. Every time she begged, they would burst out laughing and make her say it louder. When Cole refused to open his door or respond, the laughter faded, replaced by a sinister silence. Then came the violence. First, I heard things breaking, punches landing, furniture getting smashed. He swallowed hard. Then, they started eating her, and it was loud. They didn't stop until the sun came up. I sat still, not daring to interrupt him. The last thing I wanted was to upset him or say the wrong thing. So I kept quiet and let Cole talk for as long as he needed. Cole sounded like a man who had reached the end of his rope. Whether these people were real or figments of his imagination did not matter. He believed in them with every fiber of his being. And because of that, I could not help but feel sorry for him. He told me he stayed holed up in his apartment until noon the next day, waiting until he was sure the coast was clear. There was no way I was staying there another night. No fucking way. I had expected him to devour the meatloaf I warmed up for him, given how malnourished he looked, but he barely touched it. He was too shaken to eat. Once Cole packed up his car, making sure not to forget the severed head he had been keeping in the freezer, he hit the road. His first stop was an army surplus store where he picked up supplies to lay low for a while. To Cole, that meant holing up in a cheap, run-down motel that catered to hookers, junkies, and other folks society tried to forget. A week later, I was at this grocery store, Cole said, just walking across the parking lot, minding my own business, and then, bam, I see them again. They drove right up behind me and laid on the horn. He shook his head. I did not even bother going inside to get food. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. By the time Cole realized he had forgotten the severed head back in the motel freezer, he had already crossed 2 state lines. It was clear that this slip-up gnawed at him. He paused at this part of the story, fidgeting with his hands, and I kept quiet, not wanting to set him off. The fact that the shotgun was still resting on his lap kept me extra cautious. After he finished the meal I had given him, I poured him a glass of milk and offered the rest of the baby carrots I had in the fridge. Maybe, just maybe, a little kindness would convince him to let me walk away with my head still attached. Shortly after that encounter in the grocery store parking lot, Cole decided it was time to trade in his car for a van. He figured whoever was following him had probably clocked his old ride by now. At least with the van, I could sleep in it, Cole muttered, drumming his fingers on the table. Saves money on motels and shit. But the van only bought him a few weeks of peace. 5 weeks after switching vehicles, Cole said he ran into them again. This time they found him while he was asleep. I was dead asleep, he whispered, his eyes narrowing. Then I heard them say my name, snapped my eyes open, and right there, staring at me through the window, was this woman. Cole's fingers twitched on the shotgun as he described her. She had the same creepy look as those guys outside my apartment, except worse. Without the beard, her face was all wrong, like something scraped together from a nightmare. When she smiled, it was... Jesus, she barely had any teeth. And the ones she did have? They were tiny and brown, growing in weird places, like her gums and the inside of her cheeks. Even though it was pitch dark outside, Cole swore he could still see their eyes glowing with that hateful gleam. He reached for the ignition, flipped it on, and the van's headlights cut through the night, revealing dozens of them standing just beyond the beam's reach. Her whole family, Cole muttered. They were scattered across the lot, 10 or so feet apart. Some of them were completely naked. His eyes grew distant, as if he were trapped in that moment all over again. They just stood there, smiling, staring. It was like they were giving me permission to leave. Cole said he floored the gas, aiming to run a few of them down, or at least clip them with the side of the van. But every single one of them moved out of the way, slipping aside with eerie precision. When I finally worked up the nerve to ask him what he meant by her family, he sighed deeply and ran a hand over his face. That's just what I call them now, Cole admitted. At first, I thought they were demons, or maybe vampires, but I do not think that anymore. He looked off into the distance, his lips pressed into a tight line. I got my reasons, but I am not sharing them. After that encounter, Cole abandoned the van and stole a car. He confessed to me that he did this every time he felt them closing in on him. He claimed it was like a creeping sensation, either a tightening in his chest or a gut-wrenching feeling in his balls. Sometimes it was triggered by nothing more than a shadow flickering in the corner of his eye. Other times it was the cawing of crows overhead that set him off. He zigzagged across the country, desperately trying to shake them and escape the hateful energy he said radiated from them. Cole stayed indoors at night whenever possible, doing his best to sleep during the day. To pass the time, he listened to music. I was shocked when he told me that his preference was classical. Hard to imagine, given how rough and ragged he looked. Cole must have noticed my reaction, because he gave me a crooked grin and said, Vivaldi's Concerto No. 5. Now that's my favorite. Got into classy music because of my mom. She had good taste. While on the run, Cole picked up whatever odd jobs paid cash, anything to keep moving. He worked at a tractor assembly line in Michigan, manned a toll booth in Florida, and even spent time at a way station for semis out in Nevada. The only rule was that the job had to pay in cash, and he refused to work nights. No matter where he ended up, though, it was never long before he felt like they were catching up to him. More often than not, he skipped town before he even collected his paycheck. I will spare you the details of what Cole said he did to survive during these years. By the time he sat in my kitchen, shotgun resting on his lap, I had been listening to his story for over 4 hours. The night Cole showed up at my house was shortly after he fled his last hiding place, a loft above a bar somewhere in northern Canada. When I asked why in the world he thought a bar would be a good spot to lay low, Cole just shrugged. Figured a crowd downstairs would keep me safe, he muttered. It did not. He said the night they found him, they were waiting in the back alley below his window, calling his name. With all the music blasting in the bar below, Cole had no clue how long they had been whispering before he noticed. But the second he realized it was them, the giggling started. They were talking like they knew me. Said they were my biggest fans, Cole muttered, rubbing his eyes. They proved it too. Told me details only the pass-it-on killer would know. My stomach turned as he rambled on, oblivious to how disgusting his words were. Cutting off a head ain't easy, man, he said with a casual shrug. Even with power tools, it's a messy job. Took me a while to figure it out, but I got pretty good at it. Rigged a bike pump to a catheter, snaked it through the axillary nerve all the way to the superior vena cava. Once the blood stopped pumping, taking the head off was practically mess-free. I fought the urge to vomit, but kept my face neutral. I knew better than to show my disgust, not with that shotgun on his lap. Cole swore that he never spoke to them before that night in Canada. But when he finally cracked, he yelled out the window, accusing them of being vampires. As soon as I said that, Cole whispered, everything went quiet. I must have gotten used to the sounds they made, because the silence was deafening. Then someone with a strange accent answered him. We're not vampires, the voice said. We're something else. Something that... Cole stopped mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing like he was trying to recall the next part but could not. The sudden shift in his demeanor made my heart race. I had no idea what he was going to do next, and it scared the hell out of me. After what felt like an eternity, Cole blinked, as if shaking himself out of a trance. He shifted in his seat and picked up where he left off. They cut the power next, not just my apartment, everything. The whole bar went dark. He ran a hand down his face, looking exhausted. Didn't take long before I heard the bartender downstairs yelling at them, telling them not to come any closer. All they did was laugh. Cole clenched his jaw, staring off at nothing. They tore her apart, he whispered, the words heavy with guilt. And all I could do was sit there and wait. Wait for morning. He shook his head as if trying to scrub the memory from his mind. Thing is, in Canada, winter nights are long, real long. I only had enough food to last me a few days. He trailed off, lost in thought, rocking slightly in his chair. I sat frozen, terrified of what might happen next. Cole never told me how long he stayed in that room, and I did not ask. From the way his eyes stared off, distant and hollow, it was clear those events were still fresh in his mind. I figured keeping my mouth shut was the safest option. When Cole finally left that room, he said, gore was everywhere, like someone had laid out a trail of breadcrumbs. It started behind the bar and led straight to his apartment door. He made sure not to touch anything without gloves. Cole told me he emptied the cash register and grabbed a toolbox from the back office, just in case he needed to swap license plates later. I don't know how to stop them, Cole said, but I think I know how to slow them down. Before I could ask what he meant, Cole glanced at the window and saw sunlight peeking through. He looked relieved, as if realizing he had survived another night without them finding him. Thanks for listening, he said. I did not know how to respond. What do you say to a story like that? I rambled about whatever came to mind, eventually griping about my boss, how he was always breathing down my neck and would not leave me alone, as if any of that compared to what Cole had been through. I did not think twice when Cole asked me if I liked my job or where I worked. It seemed like harmless conversation at the time, so I answered all his questions without a second thought. After a while, Cole gave me a strange smile and said, "Thanks again." I figured he was just grateful to have someone listen to him. Then without a word, he reached across the counter, grabbed my car keys and walked out the front door. It took me about 10 minutes to call the police. When they answered, all I said was that someone had broken into my house and stolen my car. I left out the part about Cole and his story. I was too afraid they would think I was crazy if I told them everything. The more time passed, the more that night with Cole felt like some kind of fever dream. But reality hit me hard when I found out my boss had been murdered a few days later. According to the local paper, the Whisper Alley Echo, pieces of his body were scattered all over his bedroom. Most people wrote it off as sensational reporting, just a trick to sell more newspapers. I wanted to believe that too, but Cole's story gnawed at me. I could not let it go. Something about the way Cole talked. It stuck with me. like a sliver under the skin. I ended up hiring a private investigator, hoping to make sense of it all. That was a mistake. The investigator called me a week later to say that my boss's head had been found, stuffed inside another bloody mess all the way in Cleveland. After that, I could not stop thinking about Cole's story. If I was not obsessing over it, the memories hovered in the back of my mind, waiting for the slightest moment of peace to ruin. Soon enough, I started seeing things. Black shapes darting between shadows, vanishing the second I looked. At first, I convinced myself it was just mice or exhaustion. After all, I had barely slept since that night Cole showed up. Hoping it was the lack of rest, I bought some sleep aids from town. They helped me sleep but did nothing to stop the shadows from appearing. It was not just shadows. Any little thing would trigger thoughts of Cole's night visitors. Reflective eyes at the side of the road, the creak of the house settling, all of it made me think of them. It was as if, by entertaining the idea of their existence, I had somehow invited them into my life. I cannot tell you which came first, the whispers calling my name in public or the soft scraping at my window screens at night. But once I noticed those sounds, there was no way to block them out. At night, the whispers grew louder, teasing me from the corners of my mind. I tried to ignore them, but the harder I fought, the more they demanded my attention. Eventually, I gave in. I needed to know what they were saying. I spent countless nights awake, pressing my ear to the walls, desperate to catch every word. And it was worth it, because unlike Cole, I know exactly what they want. The first time I opened the door for them was terrifying. It was like losing your virginity, something you can never be ready for, no matter how much you think you are. Even with Cole's descriptions, I was not prepared. They looked human, sure, but only in the way a shark resembles a minnow. During our conversations, they told me what I needed to do. They said Cole's story needed to be shared, spread far and wide, so his madness could take root in others and season the meat. If you start seeing shadows or hearing strange sounds after reading this, know that it is only a matter of time before they come for you too. And when they do, you can thank me, because I am a better, more successful pass-it-on killer than Cole ever was.